Thanks, David. I want to start by commending you for having done clearly a lot of work in research to your truly background and trajectory. And I'm quite appreciative of the fact that you did that, because honestly, I'm certainly not aware myself. Very observant of you, I must say. Great question. I think the honest answer to that is failure. I'm really honestly appreciative that you brought them up again to reinvigorate my memories. That's a good question. And well, that's a great question. I feel that you ask a very good question. Arguing and debating with people, especially interesting and thoughtful and candid individuals like David.
Legacy-worthy interview. I hope to give you a meaningful piece of recording that you can look back on in 10, 20 years' time that captures a current snapshot of who you are.
Don't worry, you already have. Look at David. He does it so well. He does it with such aplomb and elegance and flair.
This is a great question.
Well, David, can I just say, this is just a shout out to David, but also a compliment I'm sure many of his previous interviews have given him. You're a great interviewer, candid, you're forthcoming, and you ask great questions. And more importantly, you definitely are a great listener. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, Happy New Year and welcome back to my podcast, Coffee's on Me, David Quan, where I strive to give guests legacy-worthy interviews that listeners can enjoy while cooking, commuting, relaxing, or walking their pets. We're now 10 days into 2023, and hopefully you and your family have enjoyed some time off and are looking ahead with great excitement. I just had a great basketball training and it feels wonderful. We are approaching 5,000 podcast downloads, and if you have been enjoying the discussions on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts, please do consider leaving a review and nominating a guest by contacting me via my Linktree, David Quan. A highlight has actually been seeing this podcast on people's recent Spotify Wraps for 2022. I cannot thank all the guests enough for their courage and insights. Today, I have the absolute honor of hosting and learning from Brian Wong. Brian is a geopolitical strategist, advisor, and philosopher, publishing extensively on Sino-American relations, medium statecraft, and where nascent technologies intersect political theory and public policy. A co-founder of the Oxford Political Review, Brian is a Rhodes Scholar and has taught modules in politics to undergraduate students at Oxford and Stanford universities. Brian, welcome to my podcast, Coffee's on Me, David Quan.
Thank you very much for having me, David.
Did Santa give you anything special?
No, I guess Santa gave me a break, which turned out to be a non-break. So that's quite special.
That's wonderful. So there are many things, Brian, that we can discuss, but I want this interview to be a legacy-worthy one, or as your high school teachers will say, a Brian level one. And admittedly, to prepare, I had gone through all of your LinkedIn posts, and because I've just completed my first draft of my qualitative methodological-based dissertation, actually on the model minority myth, which I know that you've written a lot about, I decided to inductively code all your public contents, and the themes that emerge include, but are not limited to, racism in the West, work-life balance, personal aspirations, educational advice, charity, justice, Hong Kong, and West vs. East. But the first noticeable trend I find, Brian, is that when you first started posting on LinkedIn 4 years ago, it was mainly just for your Oxford Political Review interviews. Since around 2 years ago, however, it has become increasingly personal, starting with the LGBT, then your gratitude for family, then your identity, and recently criticizing yourself for claims of workaholism. What do you make of these observations of at least your public presence on LinkedIn?
Well, thanks, David. I want to just start by commending you for having done clearly a lot of work and research into yours truly's background and trajectory, and I'm quite appreciative of the fact that you did that, because honestly, I'm certainly not aware myself of the transition, so to speak. But if I were to retrospectively invent this ad hoc justification for it, it would quite simply be that, my life has diversified and pivoted in two senses. The first being effectively that the Oxford Political Review, being a publication that I had the honor of co-founding with many of my co-founders, friends and colleagues, has always occupied a central part in my sort of, so to speak, set of priorities and what I take to be important, but it's no longer, as it stands, the only thing that drives me and fuels me. I still care for it. I still am very much concerned by its development. But here's the thing, I trust it is now in very safe hands and a very competent editorial committee with folks who are able to indeed run interviews and steer the ship very much without my input. So frankly, the extent of involvement, and especially when it comes to the front seat with a publication, has certainly gone down on my part. And that's why when I get these LinkedIn messages saying I'd like to write for the review, I say, that's great. Send it over to the pitch box and we'll get back to you, or they'll get back to you as soon as it's possible. But that does not mean, of course, that the review does not matter. I'm still tracking very closely developments and also the metamorphosis of the publication as it goes from strength to strength under the various new committees that have cropped up and also subcommittees as well. The second observation, though, of course, is that times change and people change in response to the times. Around 4 years back, I think you're talking about my MPhil era. Yeah, so I was starting out my MPhil, and I was most certainly trying to find a way to integrate theory and practice, to incorporate a lot of the academic insights and learnings and teachings I'd developed really over the years into a more public-facing routine. And the OPR, it was a crystallization of that. Since then, given everything that's occurred to my home city, Hong Kong, but also to the world around us, the vicissitudes of life, the ebbs and flows of global geopolitics, I found that my voice could have and make an impact, and indeed it has made an impact, hopefully, for some, in arenas beyond the publication that I managed to co-found with my friends. So it's through a combination, I suppose, of innocuous circumstantial shifts and also personal growth, as well as a diversification of my personal interests, that trend could perhaps best be rationalized. But very observant of you, I must say.
Well, thank you very much. And, congratulations, obviously, on, Oxford Political Review, the app that you're founding for public speaking and debate, and also your book publication, which is just incredible. But Brian, I don't just want you to regurgitate your views and achievements here that are just readily available online. And I hope that you, as a competitive debater and scholar, don't mind me challenging you. So I want to start by holding you accountable, firstly, on one of the themes that I notice on work-life balance. And that is how you have recognized your workaholism, but are still going back to that. So for example, the first time you revealed that vulnerability was 2 years ago, and you talked about the treadmill. Then you moved on to a post about vulnerability and genuine failures, and then you admitted that you have been working 18-hour workdays for 7 days a week. Then you talked about prize seeking, and then 10 months ago, you said, I have been working 19-hour workdays for 90% of the days over the past 3 months. And then a week ago, you made a post of, I've been working 18/6, which is 18 hours a week. So obviously that's already less than what you were doing 2 years ago. But if you had recognized that issue 2 years ago and had made almost a public recognition of it, why do you keep going back to this? What's been
Great question. And I think the honest answer to that is that, failure. It's a case of failure, right? There's a very clear sense that there are certain aspects in our life that we fail to live up to. And frankly, I'd be the first one to come out hands open, palms open, saying, I failed. That's the honest answer. We can try all we want, and I can try all I want to justify this and say, oh no, actually I've moved on to greener pastures, many achievements, all of these projects, and that's why I need to spend more time working. Okay, it's very easy to invent excuses, but let me just be frank. It's a failure. It's a failure of discipline, maybe. It's a failure of not being able to say no. It's a failure of always putting the work I do in the externalization of the self over the internalization of enduring aspects of the finer dimensions of life that we could only enjoy if we had a time and leisure to do so. The honest answer is it's failure. And I could attribute it to all sorts of secondary factors, but I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure actually your audience would not be interested in listening to that. So yes, that's my answer, and the brutally honest truth, so to speak.
I totally understand that when people look at, Oxford, Cambridge students, they think their lives are completely perfect. And obviously you have achieved a lot, but I can definitely relate with that sense of insecurity and also wanting to live up to your potential and capture every opportunity. So let's pull it back. You're 25 now. At 23, you had the worst health episode of your life thus far. And the 3 questions then you contemplated were, for what do we work? At what cost did I work? And then now what? Have you thought about these questions recently on your 3-week break?
Yeah, certainly, for what do we work, right? And I think it's become a bit of a mental habit, so to speak. So it's certainly been incorporated as a mental heuristic that I refer to and look at once in a while. I ask myself, why do I work? It's not so much this attempt at being, Camusian or existentialist, right? It's very easy and simplistic to fall for the existential angst and forget the second half of Camus' philosophy, which is essentially that we must imagine ourselves happy. But one way or the other, I have no intention of going down that path of being either a compulsionist or a fatalist, or alternatively, happy-go-lucky person when it comes to our feelings of elation. What I'm instead interested by is what really are the telic objectives that drive and motivate us as a collective species, and me, myself, as a personal individual in the work that I do. So I keep asking myself this question. And if I could be honest with folks here, again, it's something that I've struggled with answering conclusively. It might be an open question. It might be an unanswerable question. It could also just be a question that another friend once put to me. You know the answer to it already. You don't need to pretend that you don't know. So you do know. And I looked at her and I said, well, maybe I do know, but I know that I don't know, and I don't know that I know. So therefore, the end outcome of that is discombobulation. As for the second and third questions, the third question, which concerns essentially the prescriptive angle, right? Like, what next? What does this mean? What are the implications of that? I found myself revisiting that question with a tad more, I guess, finesse and also reticence than I did actually 2 years back. Because back then it was quite straightforward. Like, what do I do now? So there's this overarching emphasis upon action. What do you do? What's this next step, right? It's a very straightforward self-help guru post. But increasingly, the past 24 months have transformed me somewhat. And it's caused me to mellow, so to speak, right? And attenuate the ways through which I imagine and understand the future. The future is not just composed of doing. It is also something that's constitutive in being. So rather than asking what now and what to do next, I'd also be intrigued by, and I'm hoping to answer, or to be able to answer the question really of who will I be next? Who am I? Now you might push back and say, but surely who you are didn't change. Live authentically, the standard postmodern authenticity literature you get out there. But I disagree. A truly authentic self is fickle. A truly authentic self is shapeless. A truly authentic self morphs from one stage to another. It's almost like a monkey swing from a tree to tree, except sometimes it misses and it falls off, right? So very much like actually that character in Avatar 2, which if you haven't seen it yet, please don't watch it. It's a terrible watch. But anyway, you swing from a tree to tree until you fall off. And it's pretty sad, but the honest and brutal truth is we fall off. We run on a treadmill, we fall off. The treadmill stops working. What do you do? Or the treadmill suddenly throws you off balance. What do you do? Do you say you do not exist? No, you are you, even if it's injured, even if it's, an imperfect you, even if it's a hollow you, even if it's a vacuous you. Because as long as we're alive, even if we're merely ghosts in the shell or ghosts of our former selves, we're still ourselves. But that's one thing. And then to live authentically is another. And then finally, to live authentically whilst genuinely embracing the change and organicity of evolution and the dynamism of such evolution, that's a third. So to me, these questions I asked back then remain ever so pertinent and salient. And I'm really honestly appreciative that you brought them up again to reinvigorate my memories.
No worries at all. And it's really interesting, actually. My close friends know that I don't use the word authentic. I prefer the word genuine, because I feel like in an educational context, and when I used to do basketball coaching or when I took leadership youth groups, authentic implied that there was something within them that they can just pull out and that's them. In fact, it's actually that they should be growing, they should be thinking about the person they want to be and growing into that and taking actions. And that's fascinating. So what I found, I've also thought a lot about these self-help kind of literature and ideas, but what I often found helpful is that these theoretical things are much better when they're grounded with reality. Like, it's great to theorize about resilience, but it's much better to deal with resilience when you've just been rejected from something. So in your life, when do you actually theorize and think about them? Do you set out time to consider the rational philosophical arguments of them, or do they come as a byproduct of whatever's happening in your life?
That's a good question. And the answer that I would give you is, and this will also touch upon the nomenclatural distinction that you made just then, 90% to 95% of the time, I don't philosophize about myself. You could say it's because of an impediment or difficulty of philosophical reimagination of yours truly, or rather of oneself imagining oneself through an abstraction or an abstracted lens. Or you could say it's to do with how, where you're caught and swept in the commotion and the impulsive nature of the context of the immediate situation. You just don't think about the bigger picture of what this means. You just think about you. But then there's the 5% in which I do think about I, not through lenses of, I something, like a me-oriented, I-oriented action, but instead as a Brian's doing this, or let it be known or let it be thought of that there's an individual with these attributes and characteristics that are doing that. So this is what I call conceptual disentanglement. And in all honesty, right, auto disentanglement is incredibly difficult. I would do so when I have downtime. So when I'm napping, when I'm potentially on commute and I'm daydreaming, and live daydreaming, perhaps I usually philosophize. But if you look at the actual allocation of time, let's say it's no more than 5% of my lucid conscious time when I'm awake that I spend, philosophizing about myself. And yet I'd also add that the utility yielded is outsized and, obviously yields substantially greater returns to scale as compared with, the other uses of time that I might deploy it for. So whilst I only spend 5% of my waking time thinking about what the philosophical implications of this all are, that does not obviate or negate the fact that I find it a very conducive exercise and a useful way for me to really just streamline my thoughts and purge myself of the impurities and also the dearth of clarity that we sometimes experience in the hustle and bustle of life, especially in a contemporary era. So I guess that might be a surprising answer, but I don't engage in that much philosophization. And indeed, right, this sort of nomenclatural distinction that you offered just in between genuine, authentic, candor, truthful, ultimately, these are all language games. We are all playing language games. Wittgenstein, your fellow alumnus, Cantab, not an observation.
typical Brian day is?
Well, that's a great question. I feel that you're very you ask a very good question there. What I would say is this: I wake up each day at approximately usually actually around 6 to 7 a.m. in the morning. I would then go for a quick jog or some exercise. When I'm in Oxford, I would definitely go for a jog around uni parks or other parts other parks there near where I live and where I stay. And then subsequent to that, I would then usually spend 3 to 4 hours doing morning work, which ranges from obviously my academic research and thesis and additional pieces on those fronts, public-facing opinion writing, or alternatively research projects and proposals, and finally think tank work until we get up to lunch. And it is between lunch and the afternoon I schedule most of my meetings and Zoom calls. So I would usually do a string of meetings and catch-ups with folks. When I'm more laid back and at ease, it would be hour-long catch-ups, maybe hour-long lunches up to 90 minutes or so. And yet in the case of a tighter schedule or a packed day, it might just be 10 to 12 meetings that are 20 to 30 minutes each. And those folks who meet with me know that I try my very best to be empathetic and also responsive during those meetings. But that also means that because of the time schedule and how compact everything is, we might lose out on, I might lose out on the opportunity to get to know the folks I spend time with better, unless they are frequent collaborators with me, which also happens and is, that does indeed occur and is often something that I adhere to, and I respect that they can tolerate my working habits, and takes me up to the evening, so to speak. And usually around evening time, I would go for another round of exercise, or alternatively head back into writing mode, research and thinking mode. And that takes me all the way up until dinner. If I do take dinner, then that's usually with someone else. Again, it serves as a double up as a dinner meeting or as a catch up with friends, so to speak. And if it doesn't, then I work all the way up until midnight, at which I start reading and I seize all the work, the active work for the day. I start reading and I spend around 1 to 2 hours reading, and I doze off at around 1:30. So that's broadly speaking my circadian rhythm and also how much I sleep. And I hope that gives you an indication of my routine as well.
Before I ask a bit more elaboration of the reading, just a quick one. Does Brian ever snooze the alarm in the morning?
I don't know. That's largely to do with the fact that I only have one alarm. I set one alarm, and that's deliberate. If I miss it, I'm done. And if I snooze it, well, obviously I'm technically not done. But the issue there is, of course, that if I snooze it, then I may not wake up. So I always create and craft situations where my incentives are aligned with the most efficient solution. E.g., in this case, I naturally nudge myself to not snooze, because it might just mean I missed the day and the start of the day altogether.
So in terms of the reading at midnight up until about 1:30 a.m., I get reading for leisure, it's something that you're very passionate about and it's very curious. But a lot of people would say that the reading component, don't you already do that during the day with your research and your other work? So how is that then?
I read books beyond my research. Yeah, I read fiction. A massive sucker for science fiction. I also really do like classics, or not classic, but near contemporary Chinese classic novels and 武侠小说, coupled with, in a case of English fiction, I'm more of a fan of well, lately actually Jane Austen. So it's very strange. I've got an eclectic taste there, as well as, of course, non-fiction that straddles areas I'm just not particularly well versed with, like neurophysics, neuroscience, or as of late I've been looking into venture capital, for instance, which I'm sure is an area that you're incredibly familiar and well versed with. And I've had to basically force myself to get to know the literature and also the history of better, as I also work in the intersection between Web3, geopolitics, and of course public media and communications. Whether it be in a VC or startup scene, such knowledge is quintessential for a decent and solid grasp of the fundamentals, in order to then, for me, to work with and collaborate with respective partners, to vet proposals, to identify niches and openings for change, and finally to really just enrich and broaden my horizons beyond what I'm exposed to via my comfort zone at large. So I guess that's what I would say as to why I read on top of what I already do in the status quo.
I remember in primary school, maybe about year 3, I went into the library. I was thinking, reading is important. I need to read more. So I asked all the librarians, what should I read? And the response I get would always be, well, it depends what you like. And to an extent, there is some merit in that. But for you, do you have a framework or are there principles on what to then read? Because time is scarce, right? I know you've got 2 hours blocked out for that extra reading, but how do you actually determine which books or which topics are actually worthwhile to commit to during that time?
I have no perfect method. That's the answer. But I do have a few shortcuts that help guide me in the process of selecting these books. The first is essentially, I keep an active eye out for fields that I genuinely just am not well versed in. So I constantly am on a lookout for books that explicitly address these fields. So an example that I would raise is whilst I spent a lot of my time looking at, of course, the evolution of Chinese geopolitics and foreign policy, I also came to the conclusion that I was deeply, incapable of linking and connecting 1950s, 1960s Chinese intellectual thought and philosophy with the political evolution then. So whilst I'm quite well versed with the early Republican era, so all the way from the late 19th century through to 1950s, roughly around the time of the establishment of modern China, I also know contempt Chinese philosophy, so 2000s onward. I just didn't know enough about the 50s all the way through to 90s. So that was when I bought basically a plethora of selections and texts pertaining to Mao Zedong and also Feng Youlan, trying to get to know and understand their metaphysics more, and then comparing that against more recent works by, say, Bai Tongdong and also Du Weimian, who are not from that era per se, but are more established scholars, at least scholars whose works I'm very familiar with and also know of. So I'd say, to me, the first heuristic is, what do I not know? And it can be very niche, as you can see. That's a very niche field, right? I know Chinese political thought already. I know philosophy. I know Chinese philosophy. I just don't know that period of philosophy. So I need to plug that gap and stymie my inner desire for knowledge, right? Because otherwise my thirst for knowledge would not be quenched, and that would be deeply suboptimal. The second heuristic I use is this an author that I've read before? And usually there's a fork here, right? And there's upsides and downsides. Upsides, I know how they think. I know how they write. I know that when you read a Ferguson book, what to look out for, what not to look out for. And obviously Ferguson's a very charismatic writer and author. And of course, you know the habits and what they tend to do with the facts that they present to you, right? But the flip side is, if this is an author you've read before, there's also the potential downside that it's just you know them too well. So the additional marginal value of information is not as high as it could be. So whilst I appreciate the importance of thinking through the authors and who's writing it, and given that writing is a constantly political and politicized activity itself, it is imperative that we're cognizant of the power dynamics at work here. What I tend to do is, upon establishing the authorial identity, I ask myself, is this an author that I want to read? Is this an author I already read too much of? And if the answer is yes and no, then I'll definitely, put it on a high priority list, right? And alternatively, if it's an author I've read a lot of the works of and I'm very well versed and familiar with, then there's not much, marginal utility unless it's a new field, right? So that's what I would say, so to speak. And a final thing I'd note is, as much as there are folks who like to brand themselves as independent thinkers and in demonstrating and signaling the edginess, they don't tell people that they've read the most, I guess, banal texts, right, that are, or rather the most popular texts. They want to be edgy. So they say, I'm not going to read these normie books. I'm going to read these counter-normie books that are counter-current. I don't buy into that. I think normie books, or books that are quite highly vetted and rated in particular communities, like foreign policy communities, international relations communities, are probably just good reads. And you may as well give them a go, right? Because no one's going to give you extra brownie points for not reading books that everyone else has. Of course, if you find the book terrible, if you find it poorly written, criticize it all you want, critique it all you want. I write book reviews all the time. I write them for publications I want to, share my thoughts with. But that doesn't mean that just because you want to demonstrate an independence of thought, an independence of mind, that you do not engage in the conversational topics and the anchors of discussions that you likely see, right? If you are indeed at a conference, if you are indeed attending a discussion on China, there's no way that you should be proud of saying, oh, I haven't read Kevin Rudd's latest book. I mean, you can criticize and comment on Kevin Rudd all you want, and I'm sure, David, you've got your own thoughts on Kev, but his book, The Avoidable War, is just quite an interesting and well put together book. And that's quite a thoughtful read as well. That deserves attention and deserves reflection. So I guess these are the three broad tricks and tips. And then the final tip is randomness. So serendipity. I'm a firm believer in serendipity. There's a line from Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, which is basically, I'm paraphrasing here again, that all of these mistakes, all of these failures you've had in your past, Evelyn, they made you. They made you Evelyn in this universe, as opposed to Evelyn in a universe with the ratatouille or ratatouille, right? As opposed to Evelyn in the universe with all these sausage fingers. It's Evelyn. And in some ways, I can feel that, right? I can vibe with that sentiment, that every mistake and every decision we make in our life, not just in relation to book purchases, but also in relation to subject choices, degree choices, career pathways, they make us. And as much as this might be post hoc rationalization, it is also true that we are defined by the choices we make in the past, but we can free ourselves such that we're no longer shackled and bound by them. We can be defined by something without being bound by them. That, to me, is a form of recognition come emancipatory freedom that only comes from making peace with whom you really are and whom you have been all along.
Kevin Rudd is very good at handball, but after the thousands of handball games I played in the junior school, I'm confident that I can make it a competitive game. But jokes aside, in terms of conceptualizing the amount of information, so I think about it as a pyramid. In this world, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of data, but how do you get on top to get to the knowledge and wisdom stage? And I think you can make a theoretical, description, but also like physically, do you have a pencil? Do you write summary notes after every page chapter? Do you highlight? Do you use apps? Like, what is the kind of process for Brian to be able to absorb and to leverage that information to make him more of an, or them more of an independent thinker? Sorry.
Oh,
Well,
I
think on the table.
This is a good question.
Yep.
Sorry, you were saying something?
I was saying, like, are you lying in your bed? Are you at a desk? Just give us the picture of how Brian actually goes about learning.
I personally use, I would say, a mixture of tools. The first being associative, the second being kinesthetic, and third being combative and dialectical learning. So I'm just going to go through them one by one. The reason why I was a bit stumped is because this is a question that was actually put to me at one of the interviews for scholarship a while back, and they were like, how do you learn? I just sat there looking gobsmacked thinking, yeah, how do I learn? And I didn't have an answer. So no, this time I have an answer. So firstly, on the associative, I really, really enjoy drawing connections and links, contrast, juxtaposition, similarities, analogies, links, different aspects of conjunctives, okay, that essentially connect concepts with counter concepts, anti-concept syntheses, right? To me, spotting connections between concepts gets you halfway there. It already gets you halfway there in terms of learning and acquiring new information, because it allows you to embed and also tell a story that matches, okay, a grand narrative that includes as opposed to excludes this additional piece of information, like a plot detail. But the second method is kinesthetic, and I learn best actually when I pace around. So I do a lot of hiking. Part of that is because I need to keep fit. Obviously, I'm trying hard. You guys can't see me, audience, but I don't think it's working well. But anyway, but the other half of that is also because I retain and I think more lucidly, more clearly when I am indeed moving and walking around. And the final and very quick reason is to do with dialectics. I love arguing and debating with people, especially interesting and thoughtful and candid individuals like David here. So I guess these are the three means by which I learn.
That's very, very interesting, Brian. Thank you for breaking it down in such a structured manner. Maybe one of the reasons why you haven't thought about how you learn is that it has just been quite a natural part of your upbringing. And I'll be quite interested in learning a bit more about your kind of schooling experiences, because obviously, our formative years and the role models and the things that we've done would have shaped us. And what I found really interesting actually is there was that video, viral video of the intelligent Asian student, which is you debating Jordan Peterson. And one of the comments from Mason 2 months ago wrote, well, I think you know him, or you used to know him, or at least hang out a little bit. And he wrote, Brian has always been very intelligent and bright, and I always felt he was on another intellectual level compared to everyone that I knew in my life, which I think a lot of people would agree. The funny thing is, I still remember that one time when I was sitting on the same road just across from him on the school bus and thinking about whether I should start a conversation about Xbox or PlayStation. Brackets, we were about 9 to 10 years old at the time, but ultimately decided against it because I thought he wasn't going to be interested in video games. So I contrast that with what you put out, which is you wrote that Oxford all started with your head of house calling you into her office 2 weeks before the UCAS deadline. So that's like 9 years after that, whether to talk to Brian about Xbox conversation, asking you why on earth you hadn't taken up seriously the offer and the possibility of applying to Oxford. And then when you published your book, you wrote, I never imagined I'll publish a 400-page book as a 23-year-old. Is that disparity just your humility? Like, you know, if we think about your childhood, it sounds like other people would always recognize your talents and your kind of curiosity to learn. Explain to me the disparity.
Well, I've got to say, I'm not a particularly self-cognizant individual. And it is entirely the truth that actually, up until my head of house called me into the office, I'd been planning on a legal career, which would have involved me studying law, and probably not at Oxford, actually. Deep down, I'd rooted for and settled upon already Hong Kong U, thinking that would be a logical choice and the answer to my career. Secure a stable job, earn a decent income, make a solid living, maybe start a family, maybe not. Gosh, the thought of starting a family now irks me deeply. But anyway, you know, that was basically the plan that I'd had until I was inspired by my teacher. And that's serendipity. It's also serendipity that I eventually managed to publish a book at the age of 23. I'd never imagined I'd do that when I was a younger child. I'd always felt that I'd become a barrister, make a lot of money, and then retire early, you know, FIRE. They call it financial independence, retire early. To me, that's a flaming hot red alert. But then again, what do I know about financial planning, right? So what I want to just highlight here is I've stumbled into a lot of things in life. Not so much stumbling into success. I don't think I've ever stumbled into success. When I decide I want to do something, I put my mind to it, and therefore success comes. If it doesn't come, then I do think it is my fault, and I internalize that as my own responsibility, and I seek to tackle it. That aspect of my philosophy, I guess, is quite objectivist, even though I loathe Ayn Rand. Anyway, back on track. It's not so much stumbling into success. It's stumbling into decisions. Stumbling into choices, stumbling into worlds and pathways I've never ever thought of undertaking. If you'd asked me at the age of 10 what I thought I'd be doing at the age of 16 or 17, I would not have answered coaching or deputy coaching the Chinese national team and debating. If you'd asked me at the age of 16 what I thought I'd be doing, I would definitely not have said doing at, say, 25. I would not have said geopolitical risk consultancy. I would have said teaching in a university, probably law, right? So that to me is the mesmerizing beauty of life. It's innate capriciousness. It's innate ability to almost, you know, benignly deceive you and delude you into thinking that, you know, all is not well and that there's only one path. And that's when you see the light, okay? It is at that moment when you reach the end of the cul-de-sac that you realize this is not a cul-de-sac. This is the beginning of a tunnel. This is the beginning of a tunnel out of the ending. So that's how I've characterized my life so far, punctuated by critical junctures over which the agency to initiate and to enter into them has been surprisingly limited, and yet the agency on my part to make them work and to make them worth it has been surprisingly voluminous and substantial. And that's in turn a very twisted way of saying basically I've never ever seen myself as stumbling into or stumbling upwards, but I do certainly see myself as stumbling sideways, you know, from one direction into another, pivoting from one end to another. And that to me is really just an illustrative description of how my life has been led thus far.
Very well put, very self-aware and very humble. It actually reminds me of two advice that I have received that I often think back to. And number one, it is that luck plays a significant role, but you can help yourself to put yourself in places where you could get luckier. And the second one is the most important thing isn't knowing what you need to be or do in a certain time in the future, but it's just doing whatever you're currently doing, whether that's chess, whether that's debating, whether that's reading. Just do your absolute best and opportunities will come and doors that you won't even know. And it sounds like you put yourself in a position to get very lucky so that these decisions can come about, including getting a Rhodes scholarship, which is obviously wonderful. So in that same comment, apparently there was an inside joke, which I totally believe, and it's not uncommon, teachers even had an inside joke where the term Brian or Brian level is the definition and golden standard for academic excellence in the highest achievers. Do you remember much on the report card comments that you used to get? I mean, academically, you got the grade and the effort grade, that's fine, but what were kind of the adjectives and the ways with which your teachers and coaches were describing Brian?
Socially awkward, not particularly good at communicating, exceptionally bright and talented and gifted, and yet very clearly needs to learn to work in a group, in a team. An introvert, spends too much time working, probably should take things more slowly, slow down. These were the recurrent phrases. If I were to do a word cloud on that basis, I'd generate these phrases as the predominant and the most statistically frequent recommendations.
And when you get phrases like introvert, like I'm thinking like Susan Cain's book, like Quiet, for example, which, the thesis is saying that, there's nothing wrong with being an introvert. An introvert can succeed. Was there any point when you were getting these not so nice comments, like not very sociable, that you were quite defeated, mentally a bit insecure? And how did you go about?
Oh, never. I'd always thought that socializing with other folks and interacting with my peers, and that's obviously a thought that I've now moved on from. But I'd always thought that back then, it was a waste of time, right? Well, many others have craved recognition.
So you won't hang out with other peers in the class after class. What were you doing?
I would hang out with folks I found to be intellectually interesting and stimulating. So many of my closest friends back then were either fellow debaters or friends who basically did very advanced mathematics. Yes. So I took pride in being a nerd, because for a long while, I just never understood, never got the hang of how to hang out in mass, large group settings in which I was not necessarily able to do what I wanted, which is study and argue and debate and ask people questions about maths and also quiz them about Chinese literature. So frankly, I was a self-anointed and also self-determined introvert, right? And that had always been a dispositional feature. I would say I've shifted. I would say I've morphed and moved away from that, right? That's certainly not something that I now see myself as embodying, that sort of elitist, exclusionary, hyper self-fixated, and almost narcissistic sense of cocksured confidence. I don't see myself as bearing that these days. And I'd like to think I'm a pretty sociable person, but at my core, I remain an introvert. I do all of these Myers-Briggs tests. I don't believe in them, for one. I think it's very unscientific. But they keep telling me I'm ENTJ. And I'm like, I'm still not ENTJ. I'm more like, ETET, extraterrestrial. Okay, that was not funny. You see, I tried at becoming more humorous, but my puns often fail. I think that's humorous in and of itself. I call that situational humor. And when I do stand-up comedy and explain to people why I do stand-up comedy, I just say, well, at least I'm trying to live authentically, because that's what everyone does on TV after 9 p.m. in the talk shows.
Surely being a barrister and building a successful legal career, there's a lot of socializing, networking, and that kind of stuff. And, did that worry you then? Like that you weren't that inclined to interact with non-interesting, intellectually demanding folks?
No, because I was still at that stage in my life when I, very naively and pollyannaly thought that so long as I got top grades at law school, I would hypothetically be hired because of the grades, and there wouldn't be a need to network. I hadn't even fathomed the importance of networking until I guess, the first day of university. When I landed at Oxford, it was a total cultural shock, right? Trying to figure out and navigate my ways around this deeply unfamiliar and yet antiquated and yet so seemingly cozy place, right? Intellectually cozy, socially hostile, and in terms of the meteorology and a climate utterly despicable. And yet I loved Oxford, right? The weather was atrocious. Okay, it was really bad. It was winter. It was snowing. I thought, I thought snow was romantic. Turned out snow was a butcher. But anyway, right, I gradually acclimatized to Oxford and realized the need to network and to socialize. But to be truthful, right, to be completely honest with you, I did not appreciate the importance of hanging out or getting to know others, and certainly not to, not the importance, right? I was not aware of the importance of connecting with people on a more emotionally profound level, which to me, by the way, David, is what most network fixated or networking fixated individuals often neglect. They see networking as a collection of names for the Rolodex. Oh, I know this person. I know that person. I've had coffee with that person. I've got their numbers. But at the end of the day, it's not about how many you know. It's about how much about each and every one of them you know. And I often would just, encourage my friends to reconceptualize the relationships they build by encouraging them to shift away from seeing themselves through lenses of how many friends and acquaintances that they have to looking at themselves via the lenses of how many deep and meaningful connections, maybe friendship, maybe acquaintanceships that gets there still deep, right? These are what are called deep, weak ties, to paraphrase Granavetta, or just deep understandings of individuals with whom they may not even be friends or colleagues, right? But it's the depth that matters as opposed to the breadth. And that's an epiphany that only hit me sort of a few years into my undergraduate academic career. But the TLDR is just, no, I had no clue I needed to network. I didn't even want to rock up to these random scholarship information meetings or subject dinners. Gosh, it was terrible.
I agree that connections and genuine relationships are important, and that's why I also don't like the word networking. And I understand it's a language game, but it does have certain connotations that lead kids just out of high school the wrong way. So with all that in mind, were you lonely, or are you lonely?
Was I lonely? I was alone, but not lonely back then. But increasingly, I have become definitely less alone. But yeah, I do feel lonely sometimes. I feel lonely in that there's this real sense I'm carrying a lot of weight. I want to do a lot of good for the world and community around me, but it does also feel that it's hard to impart and articulate that. So it's almost like a hermeneutical frustration, a silencing, an erasure of sorts of the kind of total understanding that gives rise to solitude, that gives rise to loneliness. So I would say I was more alone than lonely in the past, and now I'm sometimes quite lonely without being alone. Because when you're in the madding crowd, you're not necessarily alone, but you're certainly prone to feeling, and it's very understandable that you feel lonely. So the way I would describe this is that lonely is a state of mind. It's an affect with the A, not the E. Whereas alone is a relational and also objective description. And obviously, you could argue that there's a degree of crypto subjectivity within alone. You wouldn't call yourself alone if you're hiking. Or maybe you would, I guess, but you wouldn't call yourself alone if you sit in an exam, right? Because you're technically not in conversation with anyone else when doing the exam, but you're not alone because others are doing the exam concurrently. So the way we narrate alone versus non-alone, loneliness versus non-loneliness is also a very, very intricate and interesting sociological and semantic question that reflects, the way we understand how we relate with ourselves and our surroundings and one another, so to speak.
Fascinating. You mentioned that you come from a middle-class family, and I was wondering, what were the values that your parents, that you as a 25-year-old now, if you think back, what kind of value were your parents trying to impart on you, whether through their words or their actions?
Work hard, work smart. The two go hand in hand. People often say, don't work hard, just work smart. But how can you work smart unless you work hard? And then the folks that say you just need to work hard, you don't need to think about the smartness of the work you do. But how could that be? Basically, like an ox. My family, my parents raised me to be industrious. And that's what I've often said to my mentees, to my students, to my friends and colleagues who ask me for advice. There's no easy way out. In life, you've got to hustle. In life, you've got to work hard. In life, you've got to put in the effort. Because you know what? Even if you put in all of the effort and do all of the work there, you may not even be at the same starting point as those who are far more better endowed and luckier and more privileged than you are. And that's what I realized, right? Coming from a city with such vast socioeconomic inequalities, I've always prided myself for being that person who would never give up, that would never stop working. And because even if I do succeed, right, because of whatever incidental benefits and luck and circumstances I have, there would always be folks that are skeptical and that would challenge me and question me. And how do we keep their mouths shut? Of course, you could say, oh, well, we can ignore them and, just focus on getting your own work right and ignore all of those naysayers. But it's easier said than done. And to me, the best means of proving them wrong is to indeed put in 165% into everything that matters that you do. Not everything you do, but everything that matters that you do, okay? And that's also a motto that I'm very much grateful for my parents having instructed and imbued me with the very insight concerning. And another value that they raised me with is this constant need to be grateful. If you've done a word cloud search and analysis of my past 14 to 15 months of posts, you might have noticed a word that you didn't mention just then, grateful, gratitude, And here I'd like to just say, there's so many folks that have walked with me in the valley of the death. I fear no evil. I see no shadows. And even if I do see them eventually, I shall not give in and I shall not cave, because I'm grateful. I'm blessed by all the mentors and friends and comrades and companions that have kept me grounded through all these years. But I'm equally grateful to all the critics, the cynics, the skeptics, the challengers, the detractors who have sought to do all they can in dragging me down. And that's great, because at the very least, remember, when someone's hating on you, they're dedicating 15 minutes of their life each day to disliking you. That is a mighty achievement. You have just won someone else's, what is it? 1 out of 96th, okay, of the day. Through what? Through being you. So in being you, you are now controlling over 1% of someone's life. Isn't that a powerful way, or a pretty interesting way of reimagining hate and reimagining yourself as a subject of scorn or and detractment, right? Instead of framing this as, ooh, why am I being disliked? Why can't I please everyone? Frankly speaking, you can never please everyone. See yourself as, wow, that's an achievement. And to me, that's, again, a motto that I would say is a corollary of being grateful. Don't get me wrong, I don't have this twisted mentality of thinking, oh, it's always a zero-sum game, how dare you hate on me. It's not like that. But it's instead, to me, it's about positive reaffirmation, positive reconceptualization of the circumstances we're in. And gratefulness is a powerful tool because it embeds within it not just forgiveness, but also appreciation. It is our appreciation of our fortune that makes us fortuitous, as opposed to our actually being fortuitous. Right? Luck itself doesn't make us happy. Knowing that we're lucky, knowing that luck has saved us, like Domino in Deadpool, that to me is a sign of true seeds of happiness, so to speak.
So I'm quite fascinated, and I guess I have a personal stake in this on, being Asian and the Asian upbringing and the stereotypes that are out there, as you are quite familiar with. And as I said, my dissertation is on the model minority myth, and I thought you wrote a really nice summary post about it a year ago about you wrote about the invisible victims of an effective double bind. I could read out the post, but I think it might be better if you give your thoughts on what that, or just explain what that effective double bind is, and your evolving thoughts on being Asian, especially in a white majority environment.
The double bind is this, right? On one hand, Asians are told that they are super smart, super intelligent, and super skilled, such that becomes the default and a norm by which people are judged. People from that particular ethnic group are praised, and whoever fails to meet that standard, even for one single moment, are therefore deemed to be an outlier, anomaly, or failure. So that's one of the binds. And yet the other binds is all of the deprecating and subjugative narratives about Asians. That Asians are less attractive, Asians are less athletic, Asians are more likely to be timid and suffer from temerity and cowardice, or at the very least be averse to confrontation. All of these are stereotypes that may or may not be sociologically and empirically grounded. They usually aren't. And yet that creates another bind, because that's the controlling image by which Asians are typified. And here I'm looking at the Black feminist thought, right, as to how Black women under a misogynistic a system that embodies misogyny are often excluded from certain jobs and occupations because they are seen to carry characteristics that are allegedly undesirable. And that would apply the very same logic to the way Asian Americans or Asians at large in the West are seen sometimes, right? And you throw in a third bind, which is the McCarthyist witch hunt and the politicized, dramatized, or the melodramatic politicization of the ethnic Chinese identity, where the Chinese diaspora are being politicized not just by governments at home or governments back in China, but also are politicized by the host countries and the countries in which many of them are citizens. They see themselves as Americans, as French, as Brits, and as long-standing residents Australians. And yet, because of the geopolitics, even they, despite having made the homes and the careers out of this country that they call, that they think would be their home and would stick out for them, they are now being targeted. They're now being tarnished with these sweeping generalizations concerning their motivations, their connections, and personal status. And that, to me, is a triple bind. So you've got 1, 2, 3, right? The bind of excessively demanding expectations, the bind of your being inefficacious in certain respects and lacking particular competences. And then there's the bind of the politics. There's the bind of the ideology that again typecasts you as l'étranger, the stranger, the outsider. And it is the conjunction and the integration of these three dimensions that culminates at the subjugation of the Asians in an invisible fashion. Why? Because Asians are told they don't need to speak up, they shouldn't agitate, they shouldn't engage in political movement. They are very successful, and it is how generations, decades after decades of gaslighting occur. It is not so much the direct denial of rights as the indirect erasure of suffering and suppression that keeps Asians' mouth shut. Shut in the West, but also in countries where their presence at large is no longer welcome or is felt as allegedly invasive and also inimical to the indigenous population's interests. And of course, the same dynamics applies to other peoples as well. The Hispanics, the Latino population in America, or migrants from and refugees, of course, from Ukraine, now in parts of Europe, and the hostile harassment that they have encountered, or indeed the hundreds, if not thousands, of refugees and economic migrants from northern Africa who are seeking merely a comfortable shelter, a decent roof, and a decent quality of life, being turned away and told that they are brethren who are not deserving of just and dignified treatment. These are all folks that are suffering invisibly because they do not have political capital. They don't have airtime because they're not seen as powerful lobbyists, and they really aren't. They don't have capital, nor do they have connections. And that's why, whilst we pity and we fetishize over the very pitying of these individuals, you do not ever grant them the agency and the platform to speak out and to voice out for the true feelings and sentiments on the plights that they're encountering. And it's ironic because we are commenting on their plights and on their suffering whilst not being them, right? And that's also why I tend to eschew or avoid talking about racism against groups of which I'm clearly not a part, even though I would stand, as you know, David, very firmly against anti-Semitism, against Islamophobia, against the anti-Black racism that we saw in parts of mainland China in the early days of the COVID pandemic. We must stand against racism across all contexts. And yet, at the very same time, a broader question thus arises. What are you prepared to do? What are you prepared to do? What are we prepared to do? What can we do? That is a question we need to think about, what I have no answer to or no clear singular solution to.
You have no clear singular solution to. However, 2 years ago, you did make an effort to build a community for solidarity. You said you were in the process of putting together a community.
That did not happen. I didn't have time. No, that didn't happen. I tried. Maybe you could do it, David. I back you. You should do it.
Well,
I know what you're talking. It didn't happen. No.
I did a number of semi-structured interviews for my dissertation on this, and certainly a lot of the themes that you had raised had come up. And, you know, one of the suggestions that the interviewee had was very much about that community and network. But I know it didn't come to fruition, but what was the vision and goal? Like, was that network there to share information with each other, to support each other? Like, what does that mean, and what did you want it to be?
A peer support group and a network of professionals that were public policy minded and were also very much keen on improving, you know, the community's representation in politics, in philanthropy, in community volunteering, and whatever careers they wanted to pursue. Basically, I just wanted to create a network where, you know, all Asians living as persons of color in white spaces could indeed feel comfortable and at ease with being whom they are, and also speaking out for the plights and sufferings of themselves and their peers.
I still want to hang in this Asian upbringing kind of context. And I know Hong Kong's obviously home for you, and you've penned a number of deeply personal pieces about growing up there and what it means to you. And you even mentioned that, you know, it could be a life's work, you know, surrounding Hong Kong. So tell me a bit more about what is the kind of upbringing like in Hong Kong when you've got the China and the West, and given the history and everything. Like, have you always been aware of yourself as an Asian in the context of other races, other cultures, and the history? Or if not, you know, when did you start having those realizations?
I think I've read about this actually in a piece that was published around 2 years back. I'd never seen myself as a person of color or as an Asian, because prior to setting foot upon the UK, for the simple fact that there was no need to. Chinese was the majority ethnicity in Hong Kong, and I'm a Chinese. I interacted with a lot of folks who were Black, Indian, white friends of mine, but I'd never seen them as, you know, persons of color or persons of whiteness or whatever. I just seen them as people. So the notion of race as an ontologically significant category, or if I were to use a neo-Marxist language here, race consciousness had never been, you know, dominant or prevalent in me during my high school days. It was only until I got to Oxford when I came to realize I was a minority, I was a stranger. I was a stranger with cultural resonance and affinities, sure, with the local sort of dominant culture. Having been brought up in a British and international school system, it wasn't that difficult to navigate the language. I had no language difficulties or cultural barriers to some extent. No, none of that. But it was when I came to interact with the population in Britain that I realized I was in a minority. It felt weird. It felt strange, because I'd never lived previously in a place where the majority ethnicity was not Chinese. Okay, I'd lived in Hong Kong, mainland China, that's it, right? So it was quite a shocker. And yet, it was also when I set foot upon the campus of Oxford that I came to realize being a minority does not mean, as we might think in certain sort of, I guess, Chinese folklore, common sense wisdom, that we ought to keep our heads low, okay, and just focus on getting the work done. It didn't need to mean that, right? The only reason why some folks would do that was because it was better for them to avoid the microaggressions. And I don't blame them or fault them for not wanting to pick a fight or to pick quarrels, okay, and also start fights, okay. That's a particular phrase that certainly, you know, many folks would be averse to. They do not want to be charged or designated troublemakers, okay, race rabble rousers, okay. Let's use that word, less derogatory. But in my view, we must differentiate between being willing to stick up for your own ethnicity and being a racial inciter. I did not incite anything. I did not intend to incite anything, but I did intend to defend myself and to speak up for myself if I were indeed misrepresented as a result of my race, of my ethnicity, or of my upbringing. I felt that sense of duty because when I arrived at Oxford, right, because I saw that there were many folks like me from a similar background, from a similar city, from China, mainland China or Hong Kong, who just said, you know, I'm going to keep my mouth shut. And I, being the combative, at times haughty, and you might say, certainly very, very hot-headed 17-year-old I was. I just said, why? Why should we keep our mouths shut? Why must the hallways of Oxford Union only be walked by white tie wearing Etonians? Which, by the way, as someone who's I've worked with a lot of Etonians, I think they're great people. But back then I just thought, why must Oxford Union be dominated by dynasty after dynasty, generation after generation of the same old people? Okay. And obviously, since then, my views have mellowed largely, and I've come to realize, not all race-centered differentiation and distinctions matter, and it is certainly not the case that we should, vote for candidates purely in accordance with whether or not they're a person of color or not. Such tokenization, by the way, is actually pretty trivializing and demeaning in their own right. But back then, I hadn't realized and developed all of these nuanced understandings. I just thought I would like to be the person who speaks up for, as many as possible, the Asians, the Chinese, the folks who feel that, they are uncomfortable with the dominance and hegemony of a certain clique and group of people and type of person in the hallways of the union, and yet were themselves too afraid to speak up or unable to speak up. I wanted to be the bridge, but also the voice. And in so doing, I opted into debating. I continued on debating, and I also opted into union politics in my early days at the Oxford Union. So I guess that was when I realized really that race was something that was stifling. It was a real category, and people did in fact arrange their life plans and therefore mold their own life chances and trajectories in accordance with race. That shouldn't be the case. It needn't be the case. And that was why I fought to ensure as best as I could there would not be the case. So that, I guess, is the overarching answer to your question. The ontological awakening is a gradual process. It doesn't come through random sort of like structural epiphanies. It comes instead through a series of punctuated microaggressions, altercations, and falling into traps and climbing back up again. And I was no exception, right? I came to that realization. The whole process took me 1.5 years, right? In my first year and also halfway through my second year. It was not until the end of my second year that I realized, it's high time. It's high time that we stood up and spoke up, and also basically went above and beyond what you'd expect us to do, qua Asians or qua persons of color in a white-dominated space, both within the union and beyond. And let me be very clear here. I do not, for one, believe in defining and also conclusively ruling people out because they're white, because they're black, because they're brown, because they're Asian or Chinese or whatever. To me, race is as meaningless a category as society makes it. It is meaningful insofar as society discriminates using it, and they would therefore have to combat it. But in absence of discrimination and alienation, I do not think we should use race as a descriptive indicator for ruling in and ruling out individuals. The only responses we ought to undertake against race-based discrimination is to neutralize unjust and undue instances of them, as opposed to actively stoking race-based and sectarian conflicts and strife. So that's, I guess, the more nuanced position I've since adopted. As you can see, it's very hard to pigeonhole me socially, ideologically, and politically as well, especially given my complexity of views and heterogeneity of stances, so to speak.
That's incredibly fascinating, and it makes me think of ever since about year 10 in high school, when I'd taken on leadership roles that, are typically held by white peers. I've got a bunch of messages in high school from Chinese parents and Chinese kids, and at Cambridge as well. I was a part of the standing committee of the Cambridge Union, ran for president. I didn't do that one.
Me too.
Yeah, of course.
I did not run for president.
Now I'm, president for the Cambridge Student Investment Fund and Cambridge University Entrepreneurs, and I have these chunks of messages in my phone where these Asians, like you said, they're keeping their mouth shut, but at the same time, they're messaging like, I'm so proud of you. Like, you inspire me so much, in the sense that I didn't know someone who looked like us could take on these roles, and now I want to put myself forward. And it always makes me very bittersweet to get so-called compliments like that, because it kind of highlights these kind of deeper issues that otherwise aren't really told or aren't otherwise heard. And I know you have devoted a lot of time to charity work, to mentoring, to coaching. So to those people who have messaged me, as a category, what would you say to them these Asian youth who I think deep down they want to aspire for leadership roles and to make positive change and to influence public policy and perhaps even to go into politics themselves, but just don't feel like they, looking the way they are, perhaps because of their race or their religion or lack thereof, they just don't feel like that public sphere is for them, and therefore they have to opt for a more safer barrister, investment banking, management consulting career path.
Well, I think to me, this is a great question, right? And it's a question I've often, found myself reflecting upon in the virtue of, what if I were on the other end? What if I were looking at someone like myself as the other person? And what would I want to hear from that said someone? Do I even care what that said someone says to me? And yet, from my perspective, what I would genuinely say to these individuals then, having thought about how they would see this, is to ask two things. Who do you really want to become? Who do you want to be? What do you want to be in 10 years' time? Where do you want to see yourself in 20 years' time? And is it really to follow this well-trodden, stereotypical career, that this template, this script that has been written for you to perform? Is this performativity, this whole performative ritual, this act that seems to be basically preordained in virtue and by your race? Are you happy with it? Are you really happy about that? Because if you are, then good for you. And I don't think you or I or anyone is in a position to say, don't go for consultancy, don't go for law, you should go with X, Y, and Z. I mean, what if they just want to live a life like that, right? In my case, it wasn't because I chose that I was therefore, hard done for. It wasn't because I originally opted for that and I gradually sort of pivoted away from that. I would therefore say, oh yeah, I should not have gone for that. It's instead I came to realize what I genuinely wanted was not that lifestyle, at least not yet. But it was not that career itself is intrinsically wrong. No, it's not, right? And I think we must be really cautious and wary of judging and being over-prescriptive in the wrong way. Like overcompensating, basically, by saying, oh, society pressures you to do this, so you must not do this. I mean, who are we to say you can't do this? And who are we to judge their circumstances? How do I know what the circumstances are? You wouldn't want me to tell you what your life ought to look like because you have your own knowledge and your own epistemic access to yourself that I do not possess. And yet, of course, if the second prong is true, that you really don't want to lead these careers, but your parents say, you must do this, or your teacher says you must do medicine, okay, because you'd be a great doctor. And I think that's when you say, okay, but this is my life. They can give me advice, they can give me insights into what my life could look like, but this is my life. Am I living my life or their dream life? Are my parents living vicariously their dreams through me? And if you realize that, yes, you are being proxied and treated as a proxy and a puppet, then the next step is to fight back. The next step is to say, enough is enough. And you appreciate the sentiment, you appreciate the goodwill, you appreciate all that they're trying to do for you. You admire and respect their kindness and magnanimity, but you want the room to breathe. And you want to be, and you want to see. And that's whom you truly, really are. So that's what I would say as advice to all of those who are struggling with this problem.
Thank you very much for sharing with what you just said. And feel free to not answer it if you don't want to. But it reminded me of a brief comment you made earlier in the interview about the thought of having a family. Really, I can't remember your exact word, but you were clearly quite uncomfortable with it. Is it right to assume that? Actually, I won't assume anything. Do you mind elaborating a bit more on your thought processes on having a family and why you made the comments that you had?
Yeah, I mean, the honest truth and the answer is just I do not personally feel the need or the personal preference of having a family. Like, don't get me wrong, I completely understand why people want to start families and have their own families. It's just I don't share those sentiments on a personal level. So I don't see it as like categorically wrong decision, insofar as it's just a decision that I wouldn't make myself. I guess that's the honest answer, truth be told.
So Chinese culture is very family-based, and it's not unheard of that, parents really want their kids to settle down, have a family, and that's the archetypal good life. And I know you mentioned how this is your life and stuff, but have these conversations been difficult with your family or your close friends? And
Oh no, my family, my friends, actually my family more so than my friends are very supportive and respectful of that choice. I would say that obviously there are friends that are quite confused. They'd like to think that surely starting a family is a natural and organic part of becoming a mature person, whatever that means. But like, ultimately, why? I keep asking them why until it gets really irritating and gets on their nerves, right? But I'm that kind of person. I'm firmly interested in the questions of why. Why should we adhere to social customs? Why should we believe in these norms? Why should we accept these rituals? Like, there's no intrinsic reason as to why the family is a moral obligation. Indeed, there's no reason why it is a morally net positive outcome that we ought to see as normatively desirable, independent of our own preferences. It's just like, do you like man? Do you like men? Do you like women? Are you cishet? Are you heterosexual? Are you homosexual? There's no right or wrong answers here, right? It's just that everyone is entitled to being respected and treated with the same level of dignity and also respect regardless of their own sexual orientation. And I don't want to wade into the debate of whether or not sexual orientation is a choice or not. To me, that's not important. That's orthogonal to that the decency and the rights that queer folks ought to be accorded with, and also the importance of having, respect for all individuals when it comes to family structures they opt into or opt out or feel compelled and pressured into or not. The only golden rule that I would say is essential is that coercion, specifically coercion against individuals or pushing them into relationships and families against their will, should indeed be something that we push back against and say no to, right? But beyond that, I don't think anyone's in a position to judge and arbitrate if a relationship is fair or not. And of course, we then have to look at the second wave feminist argument, right? That those who want to marry may well be victims of false consciousness and also be the product of a structurally non-autonomous system that puts women under a male gaze, right? So if you look at the works of Germaine Greer and her analysis of marriage and of course the female eunuch, it's not hard to see the rationale for why people might be skeptical of marriage as an institution. I don't personally subscribe to these arguments. No, I don't think they are the most salient or needed arguments to well-established arguments in favor of our rejection or repudiation of marriage, so to speak.
Moving a bit away from this marriage relationship stuff, but picking up on what you said about asking for why, and you've always been the type of person who asks for why, is it right to assume that you would only pretty much do something if there's a rational basis for it? And if that is my right assumption, then are there moments in reality when sometimes you just don't have an explanation, like that you just don't need an explanation? That, have you ever encountered challenges on that?
I don't always ask for explanations. I think there are times when I just do it, and it's all right to just do and not ask and not think about, the essence of why I'm doing something. I ask why though when the stakes are high, when the stakes are substantial, and when there are huge potential losses that would be incurred if I were to make these choices with impunity and also with impudence. So I don't necessarily see myself as like an OCD sort of why person, but if I feel that there's the skin in the game, and the skin in the game is substantial, then I am indeed interested in why, because that's the only means by which I can check myself against my fallacious, potentially flawed, and plausibly imperfect judgments and intuitions. I'm not, for one, advancing that all of these ethical questions and quandaries must be resolved through ceaseless pontification. Like, that's also why, a lot of utilitarians say, let's just follow the almanac, right? We can't possibly compute all of the consequences there are. And in truth, that would be deeply suboptimal. So rather than trying to do that, right, I would only ask why and reflect upon the underlying rationale when the context is right and when the circumstances are right. I otherwise would say I just go with the flow, I go with the heart, and I go with the sentiments, because the theory of moral sentiments guides us, shapes us, and makes us efficacious and functional individuals.
I've got few final questions to conclude, but obviously this is intended for a legacy-worthy interview, Brian-level interview, where I hope to give you a meaningful piece of recording that you can look back on in 10, 20 years' time that captures a current snapshot of who you are.
Don't worry, you already have already, so you've done very well.
That's wonderful. But is there anything else that you wish to be featured in this recording, or else I've just got a few final questions?
I guess to me, there's one thing I'd like to say to myself in 15 years' time. Might not even be the same person, literally. I would say this. You spend so much time trying to build a legacy and trying to do good. Have you ever asked yourself what you wanted from others? That's what I would ask myself.
That's a great question. And it actually was one of my final questions is you're giving so much of your intellectual content, but like what's the balance like of you and your peers? So you have successfully anticipated it. So well done to our future Brian listening to this. Third last two question then is it's the Peter Thiel question. I'm sure you have read, given your reading on like venture capital and stuff, but is there a fact or a truth that you deeply believe, but a lot of people either don't believe or don't know, or don't agree with you?
Don't know is true, or don't know that I believe in it?
I don't know it's true. So not about you, but the fact itself, the knowledge itself.
If you add up the total masses of all the ants on Earth, the weight, as it turns out, does not exceed that of the total masses of all human beings added together. So, on the contrary to the argument that ants, when collectively combined, could outweigh humanity as a species, which would be such a poetically romantic and like gorgeous sort of statement if it were true, that's not in fact the case. Humans still win. So what does that show? I guess it shows that A, I really have a lot of time to spare to be reading random trivia, and B, if the base is pretty substantial, then even if the multiple is smaller or the coefficient is smaller, the end product may still be larger than something whose base is much smaller but has a far higher coefficient. So you can actually represent that in terms of different rates of growth and do a sort of standard difference function, and then do just a dy over dx of that difference function to find a minimum and maximum, and notice that it's monotonically increasing or decreasing. But anyway, that's a complete aside. I was just talking about ants and humans. I don't know how we got onto calculus. That's what I wanted to raise as a fun trivial fact. I hope this gave you a glimpse into the way I think, which is a very bizarre and I guess interconnected, holistic way of thought.
Second to last, I don't know if you're the type of person who ever write an autobiography, but even if not, if one day biographers need to write about Brian Wong's life, what do you hope the title and the subtext will be?
The ceaseless reformist, an intellectual that's proven wrong by reality.
And what is the question that you really hope more people would ask you in whatever context, and what would your answer be?
Sorry, you cut out there. Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, so what is a question that you wish more people would ask you? You know, we were talking about understanding someone and building that strong relationship, and a lot of people know you, but they don't really know you. So what do you hope they would ask you so that you get to express a really meaningful side of yourself? And can you give the answer to that question as well?
I guess I just wish, more folks would ask me, how can I start a conversation with you? Because I keep getting, these messages saying, Brian, I don't know if you'd be happy to answer this question, and I'm really scared of starting this conversation with you. And I say, why are you scared of starting a conversation with me? Look at David. He does it so well. He does it with such aplomb and eloquence and flair. Why fear? Like, can I ask you this question, David? Why would anyone fear talking with me? Am I really that unapproachable? Can I throw this question back at you instead of answering it myself?
Well, I think your accolades are definitely can be intimidating, but I also believe having taken on leadership roles and having I realized that, say like in year 7, I used to look up at these year 12s and think they are just got their whole lives figured out. They've got everything figured out. Then you go through school, and for me, I look at some of the leaders who have been at positions who I want to be to, whether that's the role or whether they're at Oxford or Cambridge or Harvard or whatever. And at each stage when I get there, I realize that I am still at the core the same person with the same values, the same gratitude for my family and my upbringing and all the things that I have, and the same desire to give to the world. So I know, having been through that attaining certain roles, accolades, or position doesn't change fundamentally who I am, but I can understand that children who haven't yet gone through as many of these phases may think that they are a totally different person.
Absolutely. That's very, very fair. And to that, I would say, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid of asking all the necessary questions. The world is poorer when you don't ask questions.
And that's great. And how have you found, I guess, this conversation then?
Well, David, can I just say, and this is just a shout out to David, but also a compliment I'm sure many of his previous interviews have given him. You're a great interviewer. You're candid, you're forthcoming, and you ask great questions. And more importantly, you definitely are a great listener. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I hope I could return the favor by having you on at some point in the future on one of my podcast series interviews, or indeed, in lieu of grabbing a coffee, we can grab a pint of non-alcoholic water. Okay, sorry, non-alcoholic tea. Let's put it that way. Better. Or Singapore sling, because I'm in Singapore right now. So let's do a Singapore sling. But no, thank you, David. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. And I think this opportunity to explore a different side of you to the public, I think I find incredibly fulfilling and meaningful. And I really, politics aside and all of that, I really admire your work ethic. And I know it can go a bit too far, and I would recommend you to maybe step back from those 19-hour work days. But I think the way with which, the dedication with which you devote to what you're passionate in is definitely something that I can do more of. And, the extra reading and the curiosity that you do, I hope that in my 20s, 30s, 40s, that I will continue to be a lifelong learner in that regard. So thank you very much for the inspiration in terms of your habits and attitudes. And we'll hopefully catch up soon. Coffee's on me, Brian.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. See you very soon, David.